Ethically Speaking is a podcast of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics at the Daniels College of Business.
Hello, this is Dan Sweeney, the director of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics, and welcome to Episode 8 of Ethically Speaking. This is a conversation on the issue of employee information privacy and how to protect it. We had a wonderful discussion leader, Professor Andrew Urbaczewski, who is the chair of the Department of Business Information and Analytics here at the Daniels College of Business. Professor Urbaczewski has been at the University of Denver for about 3 years, having spent 10 years on the faculty at the University of Michigan at Dearborn. He is also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Information Technology Cases and Applied Research. He is an ideal discussion leader for this because his dissertation and his early research examined electronic monitoring of internet usage by employers. His more recent research has expanded to include mobile phone design, e-commerce, as well as information security education and electronic health records implementation. So let's get to the discussion with Andrew. Andrew, it seems that employee privacy was a very hot issue a couple of years ago, but may have receded in topical interest lately. Do you think that's the case or not? And if so, or if not so, why?
Dan, that's very interesting. I believe that 5 to 10 years ago, so many of these technologies that we accept today were just very new. And because of that, we're very concerned as to how they might play a role in our daily lives, in the workplace that we enter, and just in the communities that we wind up being a part of every day. We were concerned more about how the employers might actually use this data, and maybe we were moving towards an Orwellian state. Given that now, as we've become used to these technologies being a part of our workplace and being a part of our lives, I believe that we've found organizations that would want to use these in more of an Orwellian manner are not being able to attract the types of employees that they would like to, because it is still a free market economy and individuals have the ability to move where they would like to and not like to. The technology side of it has faded away somewhat. That being said, there are still issues of employee privacy that we might not think of in terms of technology, but rather in terms of things like drug testing. And certainly as we have legal marijuana becoming into Colorado, we still have issues with how does what I do on my personal time affect my job, and what are my rights as an individual as opposed to the restrictions that might be placed upon me as an employee. So I believe that the debate today is moving away a little more from the technology and more towards some of the social issues.
Could one of the contributing factors to that be that over the past couple of decades, there's been a whole new generation of young workers coming into the employee force who take the technology for granted and are very accustomed to it and aren't worried about it?
Young employees today don't remember the Stasi or the great governmental organizations that just gathered lots and lots of data, have never lived without a mobile phone or without access to the internet. And they don't think about what the life was like before that and the new possibilities that might be brought about by their governments or by their employers now that they have access to this technology. It's all that they've ever known, and they have then, as being digital natives, that's how they operate in society today.
So they don't necessarily have any expectation of privacy.
Their expectations of privacy are different. Their expectations of privacy are that they should be able to communicate with their friends and with their colleagues on social media platforms, but not necessarily have them exposed to their employers, and realizing that if they make certain things about themselves public, that they understand that these are the ramifications that come from them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks. So Andrew, there's a lot of new kind of whiz-bang technologies out there, like Google Earth and like Facebook and like security cameras, brand new for a guy from my generation. What are some of the other examples of these technologies that we probably should be a little more concerned about than we are?
I think the biggest example here is GPS and the ability for individuals to be tracked no matter where they are. And by GPS, I mean not only the global positioning system, but also the location tracking that your mobile phone carriers can use in order to be able to triangulate your position. There are some really good uses for these systems. They help us be able to find a place that we're trying to get to that we've never been to before. When the information is aggregated, it helps us be able to avoid traffic jams and to be able to find the ways that individuals might flow through a particular community or through a city in order to help city planners develop new technologies. Where it starts to get a little bit scary is that when individuals themselves wind up being tracked. And for example, that if I have an employer-owned cell phone, can use Find My iPhone in order to help track my phone should it be lost or should it be stolen, and to be able to remotely wipe it. But it also essentially gives my employer the ability to know where I am at any given time. And if I'm carrying this phone 24/7, it means not only during work hours, but when I'm off of work hours. Does that mean that my employer is using this nefariously? No. Does it mean that my employer could use this nefariously? It's something that we would need to be concerned about.
We were talking earlier about swiping cards, whether it be credit cards or identification badges or those sorts of things. And you got me thinking about how many times during a day that I do that and how much information I'm leaving behind. Is this something that one ought to be a little more careful about?
We have certain technologies that help us for security, and security and privacy have always operated orthogonally. It helps us to be able to enter buildings and be able to use our IDs. That, for example, here on campus now we've instituted new technologies that if there's lockdowns because there's an active shooter, that then all the buildings become ID controlled, and the only way to get into them is with a valid campus ID. Where it starts to become an issue in leaving our trails is more on how we put these different bits of information together. For example, one of the topics we talked about during our session this morning was the use of loyalty cards and shopper identifications, and the ability then for not only the particular vendor that has issued the card to build a personality profile of you, but then by combining that with other personality profiles that may cause that data to be used in ways that you wouldn't want to. For example, I certainly would be concerned if I found out that my health insurance provider also had access to all of my grocery store shopping data and my badging in and out data from my local gym that I might be a member of.
Well, I think I'll be a little more careful in the future. Thanks. With the advent of so many digital communication devices in briefcases and purses of employees, it would seem to the casual observer that the possibility of tracking their use in an office would be very much a fool's errand. Is it?
Oh, absolutely not. While we have so many devices to track, the computing power that we can use to actually log them and aggregate them makes it much more difficult for an employee to be able to maintain privacy within not just the office, but within the communities in which we operate. Big data and the providers of cloud computing services make it so easy and so cheap to be able to simply record this data that are using perhaps for security purposes or perhaps for recording purposes.
We talked earlier about the employer and having the right of access to any communication that's using the employer's assets,
Correct.
whether it's servers or computers or whatever. Does that right also extend to an employee using their own personal device?
I think the employee needs to be very careful about how they define that. For example, if I am using my personal cell phone at my desk, am I connected to my employer's Wi-Fi? Well, then I'm actually using one of their assets. If I'm not using my employer's Wi-Fi and everything is personally owned, am I sitting in a chair that my employer has provided for me? I think that anybody that is really concerned about that wants to make sure that everything they're doing is with personally owned devices, personally owned networks, and on property that is not owned by the employer.
That's That's interesting. I hadn't thought about it in quite that detail.
The society today where we may look at these devices and find that they are being used for what I'll call cyber loafing. I think that playing Pokemon Go or something like that, it's not really the fault of the technology. If the employer is really disengaged from the employee and the employee is trying to find ways to not do work during that work day, the employee can find it, whether or not it's actually a technology that is driving it or not. For example, when you and I were first entering the workforce, it was all about the water cooler and hanging out around the water cooler or making stops in somebody's office and just to discuss sports or the gossip of the day. It's certainly not a problem that is a technology problem so much as it is something that is a human resources issue.
Yeah. Let me ask you about something that struck me when we were talking earlier, and that is the use of shared calendars. I mean, you and I are on the Outlook system here at the university.
Sure.
And I only maintain one calendar, and that's it. So it's got a lot of my personal appointments and engagements on there too. So I presume that my employer has access to the personal part of that calendar as well as to the business part of that calendar.
Sure. And actually, I personally maintain about 5 different calendars, but the one that my employer provides for me on the Exchange servers that we have here at the university is only appointments that are university-related, work-related, and so that my administrative assistant or my colleagues or those faculty in my department can all look at it and understand where I might be during the work day. But if I'm going to schedule a picnic on a Saturday, not only do I think my colleagues don't need to know about that, and they don't need to have their own calendars clogged with my personal information, at the same time, it's not the job of the university to provide me with assets to schedule my social life.
Well, I think I better start scrubbing. We had a very interesting and active discussion this morning with our colleagues on the issue of employee privacy and how to protect it. What, in your view, Andrew, were one or two of the more interesting ideas or questions that came up during that conversation?
Dan, I was really glad that I got to be a part of the discussion this morning because of particularly one issue that was brought up that I don't normally think about. That when I'm looking at this issue of employee privacy, I'm thinking about data that is being collected by the employer on the employees, likely without their notice or at least not their explicit understanding. And today, one of the issues that really came up had to do with HIPAA and the idea of employee health privacy and being able to bring issues of their own health concerns to human resources, things that might be confidential, such as treatment for alcoholism, for example, that they're trying to disclose to human resources that they need the time off in order to deal with it, to come back and to become a productive employee. But yet, how does the employer keep that information confidential and not harm the employee's reputation once the employee has been determined to be fit to return to work, and yet at the same time be able to provide accommodations for that employee that might be necessary in order for him or her to succeed. We've seen an issue last year with Steve Sarkisian, the head football coach at the University of Southern California, who wound up going into treatment for alcoholism and was subsequently fired from the university. And there are a lot of legal issues that are going back and forth there about wrongful termination and who knew about it and when was it known about. I was very glad to have my own horizons broadened, that normally I'm thinking about this from a technology standpoint as opposed to more of an employee health and wellness standpoint.
Well, one of the advantages that we often have in these discussions, Andrew, is that we have a lot of different backgrounds represented. We had 3 or 4 people who are very senior human resource officers in their corporations. We had several corporate attorneys there. We had a couple of board directors there. So we got a lot of different case studies, so to speak, and a lot of different points of view. One of the things that struck me is that even with all the legislation and regulation recently, it's not always a black and white legal issue. There's a lot of ethical judgments that have to be made. Were you struck by that as well?
Indeed, how much of our business culture today is governed by lawyers and legal regulations, and still when it comes down to it, many times the managers and directors and employees are just put in a position where they have to do the right thing, where the right thing might not be what is set out by company policy or what is set out by law, because no policy had been created for anything like that. Nobody had thought about any of these particular issues in the past. And hopefully through organizations like the Institute for Enterprise Ethics that we're able to bring these issues more out into the forefront, and being able to have people in the workplace have them more on the forefront of their minds, and being able to make the right decision and do the right thing when the situation calls for it.
And these, at the end of the day, are the really tough decisions that help somebody kind of define who they are and what they really stand for in such situations.
Indeed.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Andrew. It's been a good conversation.
Thank you very much for having me, Dan.
Ethically Speaking is a podcast of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics at the Daniels College of Business.